Hey, welcome to another episode of Hillphoenix Tech Tip. My name is Rusty Walker, and we're in beautiful Richmond, Virginia, inside the Hillphoenix Case Division warehouse. And today what we want to do is we want to learn how to set the circuit setter or balancing valve inside of a case. Today what we have here is we have a 8-foot 05DM case typically set up for a secondary system, and what we're going to do is we're going to set this. And the reason this is so important to set this properly is that we've got to set the flow rate in order to achieve the proper temperature. Every one of our cases has been designed for a specific flow rate, and those flow rates can be found on the technical data sheet or on the legends, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But right now let's talk about the makeup of the valve. The valve, the Torr and Anderson valve here, as you can see, is a flow valve, kind of a metering device, if you will, to set up our flow. And as we can see here, we have the flow coming from here, in here. The valve is going to be located on the return side of the system so that we can fully fill that coil full of fluid. As you can see, as we look at the valve, there is no arrows located on the valve. So we need to have an indication of what direction the flow goes through. The easiest way to look at that, as I look at the valve, I can see this slanted handle where the gate comes into or against the flow. So the flow comes into here and flows into the handle. All right, now some of the other things to notice, as you can see at the top of the valve, there's numbers on this valve. These numbers are going to correlate to a hand wheel that we'll learn and use later on, and that's going to set our GPM and let us know exactly what our GPM is. All right, now a couple other things that we need to know about this valve. Prior to setting this valve, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to zero the valve out so that when we open it up and set it at the proper numbers, we know those numbers are properly set. First thing we want to do is close the valve all the way. What we should see is 0, 0. If we don't see 0, 0, then what we have to do is reach over and pull the top of the valve off. Then if we look on the inside of the valve, we can see some serrated teeth. And so then we're going to take these teeth and we're going to rotate these numbers until those numbers equal 0, 0. So now when I go ahead and go to set the flow rate and get the proper GPMs or gallons per minute of the valve, I know those valves will properly correlate to my hand wheel. Now that we've got the valve set to the proper GPM, what we want to do is we want to lock this valve down. And in order for us to do this, there's two ways we can do this. Number one, we'll take our 3mm. We're going to take a 3mm Allen wrench. The 3mm Allen wrench is good from the balancing valves from 1/2 inch all the way up to 2. Of course, if I go from 2.5 to 6, I'm going to use a 5mm Allen wrench. Now, I take this Allen wrench and I can set it through the center of the valve, and I'm going to rotate this clockwise. Now, I'm going to continue to rotate it until it stops, until it's fully, the stem is locked in place. Now, what I've just done is I've locked this valve to 2 GPM. So if an associate or someone needs to work on the case or close the case and I need to close the valve, I can rotate this and I can shut the valve completely off, stopping the flow if necessary. But then when I get ready to open the case back up and reestablish the flow, I don't have to go through the process that we just did to set this, because now when I open the valve up, the valve will stop at 2 GPMs or 1.0 on our handle. All right, now before we set the balancing valve, we actually have to know what the GPM is in order to set the balancing valve properly. So the GPM typically can be found on the legend, or we can go to the Hillphoenix website and we can download our technical reference sheet. This reference sheet is going to give us the proper GPM in gallons per foot for each one of our cases. So we have this 8-foot dairy case, so we're going to take this sheet, we're going to look on this sheet to find the model number, and then we're going to look and we're going to see that for this particular case, we have 0.25 gallons per foot. So now I have an 8-foot case, so I'm going to take that 0.25, multiply it by 8, and that's going to give me 2 gallons per minute. So in order for this case to give me the proper temperature and the proper discharge air, I need to have 2 gallons per minute. So let's go ahead, we'll put our sheet up for right now. We want to get out our Victaulic hand wheel. And this is what we're going to be using to set our Victaulic balancing valves, because this is what we have in this particular case. We need to remember to make sure our hand wheel matches our manufactured valve itself. So we notice that we have a 3/4 inch valve. That's what we have in the case. So we're going to take our hand wheel, and I want to know, we notice that on the top, regardless of manufacturer, on the top it says gallons per minute. So I'm going to take this gallons per minute, and my gallons per minute on this particular case is at 2. So now I take the 10-foot associated line, and our cases have been tested, so we know in these particular cases that this line is going to represent our flow rate. We take that up, we line it up to the 2 gallons per minute that we figured earlier in the case. Now, we know that it's a 3/4 inch valve, so we're going to come up here. We see that the valve sizes are listed here. So what I want to do is go to the 3/4 inch, rotate over to where I find this line intersects where my GPM is set, and where that intersection is, that's going to tell me what my valve setting is. So I look down here, I notice that 1.0 is where this valve needs to be set. So in order for me to get 2 gallons per minute, I'm going to take this hand wheel that's located in the case, and I'm going to set the numbers to be 1.0. Now, once we do that, then we'll lock it down. But let's go ahead and set this and go over to the case and go ahead and set our valves up now. All right? Now that we've determined from the legend that our flow rate is going to be at 2 GPM, and then we've taken that information from the legend and we've taken it over to the hand wheel, and we've used the hand wheel to calculate our valve setting, what we want to do is 2 GPM, we use the hand wheel, we're at 1.0 on our hand wheel, so what we want to do, or on our balancing valve, so what we want to do is we want to set this at 1.0. But before we get in there to set this, first let's go ahead and de-energize our fans. We also want to remove the discharge air grill so that we have a little bit more room to work. So we'll set that aside as well. So now let's go ahead and close the valve all the way to 0. All right, and as we do this, as you can see, the valve is already calibrated to 0. Oftentimes they are, sometimes they're not. So we must check them every time before we set them. All right, so now we're calibrated, the handle of the valve at 0. We have no flow. So now let's go ahead and set the balancing valve to 2 GPM. And as we said earlier, 2 GPM means I will set the handle at 1.0. Now, one of the things that we talked about is we want to make sure that if somebody comes along, they need to service this case or whatever reason, an associate may come close this valve accidentally, then open up, that when they open it back up, it stops at 1.0. But we want to be able to close it for service. So let's go ahead, take our Allen wrench, set it through here. Remember to stick it in the center of the hole. I'm going to turn this clockwise until it stops. Now once it stops, I know this valve has been locked. Go ahead and close it all the way back. The valve's set at 0, 0. The valve is completely closed. We're at 0 flow. And so now we can do our service or whatever we need to do to this case. So now we're done with our service. We want to open it up. But remember, we want that 2 GPMs. Let's see what happened when we set that Allen wrench. I'm going to rotate it all the way counterclockwise until it stops. Notice that it stops at 1.0. So now I've set this and locked this down at 2 gallons per minute. So we're ready, we're finished with this one, we're done, and now we're ready to move on to the next case. Now let's go ahead and follow the same procedures we used here with the rest of the cases, because it's very important that we set the flow rate properly on all these cases and that we get this done so that we have a more efficient, more energy efficient system when it operates. I hope you've enjoyed this quick lesson on how to properly set a balancing valve. My name is Rusty Walker, and that's your Tech Tip.